everyone. I am Dr. Amanda Kraus, and I'm joined by Mr. Anthony Moles, and we will be discussing our presentation, Defining a Musician's Stereotype.
Thanks, Amanda. In contrast to personal identity, social identity is how we define ourselves as members of social groups. Social identity results from self categorization, one's identification as a member of certain groups, in groups, and not others, out groups. Self categorization causes evaluations of our in groups through comparisons to out groups based on attributions and value dimensions. Depersonalization occurs when a salient cue causes our self perception to be dominated by social identity. Depersonalization results in stereotyping, the process where we tend to see group members in terms of associated group characteristics. While stereotypes can cause harm, they may provide an adaptive function by simplifying the social world and helping decision making. Self categorization also results in self stereotyping and seeking to conform to in group stereotypes. These processes enable us to answer the question, who am I and what should I do? However, our research does not assert that stereotypes are accurate representations of members of social groups. Stereotypes cannot be objectively true as social groups are not homogeneous. The social perceptions of scientists have been investigated through the classic Draw a Scientist test, the DAST. Researchers assess participants' drawings of scientists against stereotypes identified in the literature. In 2020, Ferguson and Lizotte concluded that the scientist stereotype is a middle-aged to old Caucasian male wearing a lab coat using science equipment. Exemplars are members believed to best embody the group, and the scientist stereotype may be based on exemplars including Einstein, Newton, and Bell. Linville and Fisher propose the majority of beliefs about outgroups stem from second-hand exemplars, stereotypes conveyed through media, fiction, and statements made by people we know personally. Research on musician stereotypes often focuses on personality traits. A study by Cameron and colleagues found limited evidence of personality differences between band members. However, they found a consensus on the traits attributed to other band members, indicating the presence of stereotypes. Most notably, singers were rated by others as the most extroverted and neurotic, while bass players were perceived as more agreeable. Another study found that participants rated imaginary male musicians playing stereotypically feminine instruments, the flute and harp, as possessing more stereotypically feminine traits. Interestingly, imaginary female musicians were rated as possessing more stereotypically masculine traits, regardless of whether they played tuba or drum, which are stereotypically masculine instruments, or flute and harp. This research did not seek to investigate the broader social perceptions of musicians as a social group, highlighting the need for further research.
Thanks, Anthony. So, as part of a larger project examining the factors influencing musical and scientific identity, the current study we're talking about today focused on people's conceptualizations of musicians. And in particular, we are applying Chambers' Draw Scientist test, the DAST, to musicians to see if we can identify musician stereotypes. The DAST gets participants to illustrate what they think a scientist looks like, assessing the prevalence of drawing common scientist attributes such as test tubes, solutions in glass equipment, rockets, machines, lab coats, eyeglasses, and facial hair. For our musician translation, we were interested in the prevalence of common attributes, some of which were retained from the DAST, like age and hair, and some that we took as what might be an equivalent, such as instruments rather than lab equipment. Before we go any further, Anthony and I would like to acknowledge former fourth-year graduate Diploma of Psychology students Benjamin Palmer, Brittany McLucas, Joel Stevens, and Caitlin Gilchrist, who assisted in collecting the data for this project. The data we're using for this exploration comes from a larger online questionnaire. The larger survey had a number of measures as well as this drawing task. For the research aim that we're talking about here, we're really only using that collected data from the drawing task. So our sample is those people who completed the drawing task within this larger survey, which is a sample of 89 participants. Participants were aged 17 to 73, and 81% of our sample were women. 2/3 were living in Australia, but we did not limit by geography for this particular analysis. We used a code book to identify the presence of stereotypes in the drawings and used reflexive thematic analysis to examine people's drawing origins via their free text responses, adopting a reflexive and recursive approach to consider the data. The presence of stereotypical markers was identified via an amended DAST checklist. Working from the DAST with specific reference to a pre-established checklist procedure, we created a workflow for the musician drawings. The checklist includes a number of features which are coded categorically. For instance, apparent age was coded as younger or older. And then other features are coded as a presence or absence. So a stereotype being there, such as the inclusion of a musical instrument versus not present. The presence of stereotypes across the categories can be totaled to give a total stereotype score if you follow the DAST procedures, but we were firstly interested in establishing any prevailing stereotypes for musician drawings. So today we're not talking about a total, we're speaking to the individual categories. And so here's a sampling of the drawings we received. As you can see, there are a number of instruments and actions represented. Figures appear to be both male and female, and the level of drawing differs between each one. I'm super fascinated by these drawings, so you'll continue to see numerous participant drawings on the next slides as well. Based on the drawings, we are asking ourselves, what is the prevailing stereotype of a musician? Firstly, we can consider the depicted person's characteristics. Across the coding categories, the percentages are noted here in the table on the slide. For example, if we take gender, we can see that 39% of the drawings were perceived as a drawing of a female, 35% as male, and 26% were indeterminate. In other words, we didn't have a clear consensus on whether the person drawn was depicted as male or female. As a result, and in contrast to the DAST, where scientists are mainly drawn as male, we don't think that there's a clear gender stereotype for the musician. Also, in contrast to the older scientist stereotype, we find that the majority of drawings depict somebody who is considered to be looking younger rather than older. So in this case, we do have a clear age stereotype. In terms of the other categories, hair was more often neat when it was depicted. There was no clear stereotype for the dress or attire that was included. And facial expressions were positive. People were drawn as smiling or actively performing. For example, if you look on the left-hand side of the slide, there's a depiction of what I think is Taylor Swift, with a mouth open and music notes coming out of the mouth to the left-hand side. Additionally, we were looking at whether there would be clear stereotypes in terms of the symbols or materials in the drawings. For a scientist, this is lab equipment in the drawing. For musicians, this is what we are looking at. We found that musical notes were the likely abstract symbol drawn. This includes musical notes and sometimes staff lines and treble or bass clefs. A wide range of instruments were included in terms of tangible materials. In fact, only 6.7% of drawings had no tangible item, such as an instrument or a microphone. By frequency count, guitars, microphones, pianos, and violins were the most popular instruments depicted. And in the cases where some sort of background was drawn behind the person, it was largely a performance venue, a stage or a concert hall. For example, you can see the stage lights in the picture on the bottom right-hand side of this slide. Lastly, in terms of working style or what perceived sort of action people were perceived to be doing in the drawings were overwhelmingly of people performing, playing instruments, or singing. Our thematic analysis of the drawing origins was based on the open text responses. Here on the slide, we have two examples. The one on the upper right points to a held stereotype of a classical musician, and the one on the left points to considering a favorite famous musician, as well as friends who are musicians. In looking at the categories of the origin responses, we see strong influence of famous people, especially if that's inclusive of broader media statements as well as stereotypes being mentioned. Personal experience is also referenced quite a bit, and far more than school experiences, and far more than personally known individuals like friends, family, or teachers. So, if a scientist is a middle-aged to old male wearing a lab coat using science equipment, then the musician appears to be a neatly presented younger person with a positive expression playing an instrument in a performance setting. We believe that our study extends research into musical identity to more fully explore the role of beliefs and stereotypes. Because social evaluations are based on attributions and valued dimensions, these findings have practical implications for how educators and practitioners can create environments that promote engagement. For instance, Hanover and Kessels point out that you have to have a match in a stereotype to be likely to enroll in a science class, etc. So here we can see how stereotype matching will have an influence on people's participation. We might even stretch our bow to consider the why-try model. The why-try effect proposes that those who internalize the stereotypes directed towards them and accept them as legitimate suffer more significant harm to self-esteem and self-efficacy, which, in turn, influences goal attainment as well as engagement in evidence-based practices. While this model originally considered self-esteem and self-efficacy as mediators, other psychological constructs have been proposed to buffer the impact of self-stigma on goal achievement. So we could come back to this body of work and look at how we might be able to mediate the effect of stereotypes or prototypes on music participation and identity. It would be great to see future work explicitly consider self to prototype matching. And if we turn to the broader program of research from which this particular bit of research comes, we have additional data that pertains to identity and self-concept. So we can explore that in relation to these stereotypes. We look forward to sharing findings from our additional analyses at future conferences.